Okay. Let us continue. Colonialism and Resistance. A century after the Great Plains were cleared of indigenous people, who were penned into disparate reserves and quarantined from settler society, the dynamics of Canadian colonialism had changed. Oh, no. You didn't ruin the food segment. I was planning on switching to this anyway. In several respects, the reserve system had outlived its usefulness for the Canadian government. Canada no longer feared any return to Indigenous forms of living. It would be manifestly impossible in most parts of the country for that to happen, given the decimation of Indigenous societies and the extent to which settler society had taken root and controlled the land itself. As this chapter documents, the post-Confederation period was about consolidating Canadian dominion over the land, and then systematically dismantling the structures and institutions of Indigenous culture, forcing them into utter dependence on the colonial government. By the middle of the 20th century, as Hugh Shewell notes, most reserve communities had become government-managed slums where meager relief was given in exchange for labor. After the Second World War, the structures of Indian affairs domination became less direct, as they gradually blended and interacted with other elements of the government bureaucracy. But Indigenous self-governments remained restricted, and local leadership was often coerced and co-opted by Canadian officials, creating a layer of Indigenous bureaucrats who, whatever their intentions, often served to further the interests of the settler state. Meanwhile, forced dependency on social services and support made it difficult for Indigenous people to organize opposition. Métis scholar Howard Adams was sharp in his critique. The three national organizations, Assembly of First Nations, the Native Council of Canada, and the Métis National Council, were typical middle-class bureaucracies that were not at all representative of the Native masses. In some Native organizations, the influential decision makers were white consultants and, in the case of the Indian Brotherhood organizations, even employees of the Indian Affairs Branch, the colonizer. Our real struggle is in the streets and in the native ghettos, fighting with our people against colonialism, not seeking prestigious but powerless positions. With most Indigenous land occupied by settlers and Indigenous governance largely controlled by Ottawa, it was no longer necessary for the Canadian state to restrict Indigenous people to reserves, and so movement was much less regulated. The consequence was a gradual drift away from the reserves, especially beginning in the 1980s, as Indigenous youth moved to cities to try and find work and to escape the misery of the reserves, which tended to be underserviced, underfunded, and bereft of economic opportunities. Living conditions on many reserves in the 21st century have been described as third world, a term attempting to capture the poverty and deprivation of places like Attawapiskat, a northern reserve where some 1,500 people were living in tents, sheds, shacks, or condemned houses, with black mold and no running water, electricity, insulation, or proper heating. Attawapiskat was by no means a unique case. Similar situations existed on other reserves, several of which were declared states of emergency in the 2010s. These conditions added fuel to a myriad of social problems already afflicting communities scarred by colonialism and trauma. All the while, Canadian capital continued to covet Indigenous land, even the small parcels of it that remained after the major land grabs of the 19th century. Despite Canada's hold over formal Indigenous leadership, conflicts emerged around Canadian mega-projects, essential components of its capitalist development, like the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, mining projects around James Bay, and the construction of massive hydroelectric dams in northern Manitoba. I will tell you, Manitoba Hydro spends a shit ton of money promoting how its projects are done in glorious partnership with Indigenous communities. And Manitoba Hydro is a crown corporation. Canadian mining companies claimed Indigenous territory in the north, oil and gas companies claimed Cree and Dene territory in Alberta, and pipelines were regularly built through Indigenous territory, despite communities like the Lubicon Cree rejecting such proposals. Theft of Indigenous territory spurred active resistance through legal and diplomatic channels, but also in the form of direct action. An attempt to seize Mohawk territory to extend a golf course at Oka was stopped by Indigenous blockades. Efforts to steal Six Nations territory in southern Ontario for real estate development were interrupted by direct action and occupation of that space. Despite killing Dudley George of the Ojibwa Nation, the Ontario Provincial Police were not able to claim Ojibwa territory to maintain their Ipperwash Provincial Park. These mobilizations were not spontaneous expressions of sudden anger. Rather, they were a consequence of growing Indigenous militancy in the face of colonialism, militancy which had emerged in parallel to the official, bureaucratic Indigenous leadership that Canada had promoted. As early as the 1960s, Indigenous people had built anti-colonial movements like Red Power and the American Indian Movement, in spite of official leadership, tying their struggle to that of oppressed people around the world. For the first time in several decades, Indigenous resistance was growing. There were at least 300 major Indigenous political demonstrations in the 1960s and 70s, galvanized especially after Pierre Trudeau's government issued the White Paper in 1969. A clumsy attempt to scrap the treaties and privatize the reserves. The 1980s saw the culmination of a major challenge from the Dene Nation in Canada's Northwest Territories, and standoffs like Oka and Ipperwash marked the 1990s and 2000s. Such confrontations over land continued, while the 2010s also featured the movement called Idle No More. You just got perma-banned from Blue Sky for being opposed to Doug Ford and Daniel Smith? Yeah. That sucks. Fucking Blue Sky. Well, the 2010s also featured the movement called Idle No More, a broad series of actions and demonstrations against Canadian colonial injustices, and a social media campaign highlighting violence against Indigenous women, where they pointedly asked, "Am I next?" Settlers, their newspapers, and their government often responded to these and similar standoffs with a mixture of fear and anger. Who were these terrifying warriors wearing masks, wielding rifles, and threatening violence? Where did they come from? How dare they try to interfere with the development of our businesses and our economy? Aren't they grateful to live in the greatest country in the world? In some cases, ideologically committed settlers actually mobilized counter-demonstrations against the Indigenous blockades. During the standoff at Caledonia, where Six Nations protesters blocked the entrance to a housing subdivision being built on their land, I witnessed an extraordinary spectacle of enraged white settlers screaming at the Six Nations protesters, trying to initiate a physical confrontation. They had been whipped into a fervor by noted neo-Nazi organizer Gary McHale. And on several occasions, they broke out into spontaneous singing of the Canadian national anthem, waving Canadian flags as they sang of their home and native land. Similar spectacles were made at settler counter-protests during a wave of rail and highway blockades in the early 2020 Following Canada's attempt to force a pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory against the wishes of the community. Inadvertently, perhaps, they had put the lie to the claim that Canada included Indigenous peoples. They were reminding us that Indigenous peoples were only included in Canada as a subjugated minority, and that at the first sign of any assertion of Indigenous autonomy, or even demands that Canada respect the treaties it signed in the first place, would evoke forceful reminders that Canada is a colonizing force. Settlers often celebrated crackdowns against Indigenous protesters, and the unit of police who killed Dudley George in 1995 even made t-shirts and mugs that glorified the attack. These conflicts threw the ongoing Canadian colonial project into sharp relief. Canada was breaking treaties and stealing land for capitalist development. In the face of Indigenous resistance, Canadian settlers reasserted all of the nascent colonial values that otherwise remain hidden. Indigenous artist and scholar Leanne Simpson describes it well. Over the past several centuries, we have been violently dispossessed of most of our land to make room for settlement and resource development. The very active system of settler colonialism maintains that dispossession and erases us from the consciousness of settler Canadians, except in ways that are deemed acceptable and non-threatening to the state. We start out dissenting through state-sanctioned mechanisms like environmental impact assessments. Our dissent is ignored. Some of us explore Canadian legal strategies, even though the courts are stacked against us. Slowly but surely, we get backed into a corner where the only thing left to do is put our bodies on the land. The response is always the same: intimidation, force, violence, media smear campaigns, criminalization, silence, talk, negotiation, new relationships, promises, placated resistance, and then more broken promises. The story repeats itself. Canadians today like to imagine that this country has moved beyond the racism of the past, but this is largely a myth sustained by the self-delusion of settlers who cannot bear the consequences of admitting that Canadians came as conquerors. The evidence that Canada remains a segregated society founded upon conquest is everywhere around us, if we only choose to look. Just as they once claimed Indigenous peoples to be savages who would scalp you as quickly as they look at you, modern settlers peddle myths that bear equally little resemblance to the truth. They don't pay taxes. They only get jobs because of affirmative action. All they do is whine about the past. These misleading platitudes are shared and affirmed at every level of Canadian settler society. Anyone who doubts the extent to which these and other colonial attitudes remain hardwired to the Canadian psyche would do well to read the comment sections and online news articles about two significant court cases. The 2017 acquittal of Gerald Stanley for shooting Colton Boushie in the head, and the 2018 acquittal of Raymond Joseph Cormier for the rape and murder of Tina Fontaine. In the former, a white settler murdered an Indigenous youth for trespassing on his property, and a Saskatchewan jury acquitted him on the dubious claim that the gun misfired at precisely the moment he aimed it at Boushie's head. In the latter, a white settler was exonerated despite the jury's hearing evidence that he had spoken openly about killing Fontaine, a 15-year-old Indigenous sex worker. The public comment sections on articles about these cases revealed such disturbing levels of settler racism that many news sites had to disable commenting entirely. Part 1 of this book spotlights the foundation of Canadian foreign policy. In this survey of Canada's formative relations with Indigenous nations, I have emphasized the capitalist imperatives and colonial ideologies at the heart of Canada. The picture is not flattering, nor is it exceptional. the development of Canada fit the predictable patterns of a settler colony born out of European expansion in the 15th and 19th centuries. Yep, exactly. It's just find and replace for whoever is being vilified. Though it gradually took on a uniquely Canadian character, many of the same basic patterns are found in studies of the United States or Australia, or in more modern cases that follow similar logics, from South African apartheid to Israel's occupation of Palestine. These themes are crystallized in a booklet published in 1914 by the Board of Trade of the PA. The PA, its name a French adaptation of the Cree word for wooded narrows, is a town in central Manitoba, near the border with Saskatchewan, where my father was born in 1944. The site is not far from where much of the fighting in the War of 1885 took place. The town grew in the wake of their defeat. The themes of the Canadian project, capitalism, colonialism, are clear in the promotional booklet, published the same year that the McKay Indian Residential School was built, 7 miles to northwest of the town. In 1910, the Dominion government, having previously removed the Indians to the north side of the river, laid out the town site of the PA and placed upon it the market. At that time, the whole white population did not exceed 6 families. Almost immediately, people began to move in, and so rapid was the settlement that in 1912, it was evident that the PA was bound to become an important town, and at that time was ripe for organization. Accordingly, the proper steps were taken, and in May 1912, the town was incorporated under the name of the PA, and Herman Finger, manager of the Finger Lumber Company and a pioneer of the district, was elected mayor. The removal of the indigenous people from the development of a white settlement dominated by a lumber company were not distinct ideas or projects. Settler capitalism and the colonial imagination are, in fact, inextricably linked. Understanding culture as an entire economic, political, and social mode of life, it becomes clear that the colonial ideologies that denigrate and attack indigenous cultures are part and parcel of the concrete material practice of stealing and settling land for the purposes of capitalist expansion. One makes little sense without the other. This is articulated clearly in Glenn Sean Coulthard's careful analysis of the Dene Nation's struggle to protect its territory from the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline and related capitalist projects. As negotiations proceeded between Canadian and Dene leaders in the 1970s, Canada sought to placate Dene leaders with offers of cultural recognition while effectively privatizing Dene territory, irrespective of the fundamental contradiction that entailed. Citing government negotiators, Coulthard explains, recognizing the cultural claims of First Nations would be permitted, but only insofar as those claims could be reconciled with the predominantly private enterprise mode of organization. In short, settler capitalism is itself a culture, one that will tolerate other cultures only after they have been drained of their essential content and reduced to a collection of tokenistic reference points that cannot threaten the capitalist order. Though it may sound radical, this logic has formed the core of Canadian foreign policy for over 150 years. Chat, I have to go to the washroom. I am so sorry. Give me 2 minutes and I will be right back. And we will continue reading part 2, Canada in the Catastrophe years. All right, chat. Let's continue. Canada in the Catastrophe years. Great Wars and National Nativity. Unlike whites, there is no diversity among blacks. They lead the same kind of life, eat the same food, and concentrate their thoughts on the same few subjects. The result is that, little by little, they now have the same identical brain. We whites, on the other hand, learn to know so many different countries inhabited by such varied people, and we encounter so many different things that our ideas become as diverse as our characters. Quote by William Stairs, Canadian military captain in Africa, 1891. Among the most dubious inventions of the late 19th century was the concept of racial science, the idea that different races of people could be categorized and generalizations made about their relative physical and mental capacities. That this so-called science has long since been debunked is no great comfort to the millions of people around the world who suffered as a result of its application, or the many different forms that white supremacy adapted through the 20th, or of the many different forms that white supremacy adapted through the 20th century. D&D for racists? Yeah. Part 1 of this book detailed the colonial project from which Canada was born, a project that mobilized the ideas of white supremacy, including the racial science referred to in the quote above, to claim that white people had the right to conquer and seize the land that became Canada. The ideology that claimed superiority over Indigenous peoples worked in harmony with the material goals of the settlers, namely the capture of land and its conversion into capitalist private property. But neither that project nor its ideology operated in a bubble. Canadian colonialism paralleled that of other European settler colonies, and while Canadian white supremacy had Indigenous peoples as its initial primary focus, that logic was nevertheless applied to all non-white people. As such, when Canada looked outward from the territories it conquered in North America, it saw plenty of darker races in need of civilizing, a fact that would remain consistent across more than 150 years of Canadian history. This chapter examines the period leading up to the Great War of 1914 to 1918, emphasizing Canada's role in buttressing and sustaining the goals and ideology of the British Empire, even while the shifting class character of Canada meant that the Canadian elite had to contend not only with external threats to its capitalist profits, but also a growing internal revolt. Canada at the Fin de Siècle. Canada was officially confederated in 1867, and its continental territorial boundaries were determined by the aggressive clearing of the indigenous peoples of the Northwest. In the ensuing decades, Canada consolidated its genocidal campaign to eradicate Indigenous society through the apartheid-style reserve system, the curtailing of Indigenous political structures, the kidnapping of Indigenous children for re-education in residential schools, and the aggressive use of police to enforce these rules. Many of these practices were just gaining steam in the early 1900s, as Europe was drifting towards its internal war. To some observers, there may seem to be a strange contradiction between Canada sending soldiers to fight for freedom in Flanders Fields, even while it was intentionally starving Indigenous people in open-air prisons on the plains. God. This is only a contradiction if we believe that the Great War was, indeed, a fight for freedom. If, on the other hand, we recognize that the global war of 1914 to 1918 was really a struggle between European empires, not so different in motivation from the wars between the French and the English in North America in the 18th century, then Canada's participation makes much more sense. Um, sorry. If, on the other hand, we recognize that the global war of 1914 to 1918 was really a struggle between European empires, not so different in motivation from the wars between the French and the English in North America in the 18th century, then Canada's participation makes much more sense. Canada, after all, was itself born of colonialism. The entire Canadian project was premised on the idea that the English were a superior race and should therefore expand the reaches of their empire, conquer all who stand in the way, and grow the capitalist world market as widely as possible to their own advantage. The Canadian elite were emotionally and economically invested in the British Empire, and the Great War threatened to undermine the very empire they had helped build. That empire had created the settler capitalist project that Canada embodied, and the society Canada was building was increasingly divided along the lines of race and class. While white settlers, especially early homesteaders, were encouraged to consider themselves superior to indigenous peoples and African slaves, that sense of superiority did not prevent the ruling class from exploiting their labor in order to extract profits. The Canadian elite would use settler racism to keep the white working class divided from indigenous and other marginalized peoples, especially during moments like the War of 1885, when it appeared that they might make common cause against Ottawa. But the elite also considered the growing working classes expendable. They could be useful as a garrison against indigenous resistance or as laborers on farms and in factories, but they would be sacrificed for the empire if necessary, and sacrificed they were. Indeed, it is easy to get caught up in Canadian settler mythologies about pioneers and homesteaders, such that we forget that a growing portion of the Canadian population in 1900 were urban and industrial workers, exploited in factories, paper mills, chemical plants, construction sites, mines, and the railway. Despite the aggressive settlement of the West for agricultural production, the urbanization of Canada proceeded so rapidly that by the early 1920s, there would be more people living in the cities than the countryside. As elsewhere, the industrialization and urbanization brought the harsh realities of class capitalism into sharp relief. Inequality and poverty became more visible and were reflected in the development of slums and ghettos and the privileged reformers who wanted to clean them up. Pearl clutching over the dangers and vices of urban life tended to demonize the poor, and this fault line of social conflict took on increasingly racialized dimensions. The Canadian ruling and professional classes were almost exclusively British, outside of Quebec, as was the core of the settler population, which dominated the growing clerical and bureaucratic ranks. Notably, however, the later waves of immigration that swelled the ranks of the working class were not. Italians, Bulgarians, Poles, Ukrainians, Irish, Jews, Germans, and other people from Eastern Europe and the Balkans arrived in cities like Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg, and were subject to varying degrees of racism and exploitation. Indeed, Canadian industry increasingly recruited non-British workers precisely because they had less wherewithal to complain or organize against poor labor conditions. By and large, these groups of immigrants, in addition to Black people and those Indigenous people not confined to reserves, did the hardest and poorest paid jobs, even as mostly Anglo owners of the largest corporations and banks generated significant profits. As early as the 1880s, there were serious stirrings of a Canadian labor movement, and by the turn of the century, the prospect of a full social revolt was not fanciful. On the Pacific coast, Asian immigrants worked as farmers, fishers, merchants, and miners, but were segregated and subject to serious restrictions ranging from lack of voting rights to minimal access to housing. The infamous case of mass exploitation in Canadian history was that of the Chinese workers who built the Canadian Pacific Railway. Their lived experience was closer to forced labor than wage work, and they were directly supervised by the Northwest Mounted Police. The railroad was completed in 1885. No Chinese workers were allowed to pose for the famous photograph, naturally, but many still intended to stay in Canada and bring their families, especially given the waves of social upheaval in China at the time. Their plans were upset by a Canadian government that feared a diminution of the British character of British Columbia, and therefore imposed a head tax, essentially an entry fee, which was progressively increased from $10 to $500 on every new Chinese immigrant. Similar restrictions were placed on Japanese immigrants after 1907, after racist mobs attacked Asian sections of Vancouver. Said Vancouver's Daily Province in 1907, "We are all of the opinion that this province must be a white man's country. We do not wish to look forward to a day when our descendants will be dominated by Japanese or Chinese or any other color but their own." A few years later, another magazine took it further, explaining that the Jap sets his teeth when difficulties arise, and the only way to keep him down is to kill him. A popular bar song in Canada at the time was White Canada Forever, which featured the lyrics, "We welcome as brothers all white men, still but the shifty yellow race, whose word is vain, who oppress the weak, must find another place." chat. Wow. The Canadian government had to tread more lightly in its exclusion of Indian immigrants, given their British imperial connection, but nevertheless found ways of discouraging immigration of South Asians in general, most famously in Canada's refusal to allow the Komagata Maru, an Indian ship carrying nearly 400 would-be immigrants from across South Asia, to dock in Vancouver. Furthermore, when Canada did allow South Asian immigration, it policed their communities heavily in order to root out Indian nationalists who sought freedom from Britain. This policy was personified in the reviled immigration officer W.C. Hopkinson, who developed a network of informants within Vancouver's Sikh community to report on the Ghadir party of Punjabi nationalists abroad working to undermine British rule. After one of Hopkinson's informants opened fire and killed 2 Sikhs at the funeral in the Vancouver Gurdwara, Nuwa Singh, a member of the Ghadir party who was in the temple during the murders, assassinated Hopkinson. Singh had dealt with Hopkinson once before when he was arrested for trying to provide provisions and support to the passengers of the Komagata Maru. He accepted full responsibility for the killing, telling the court that if Christians saw their people shot down in a church, they would act similarly against the perpetrators. Singh's trial was held almost immediately, and he was sentenced to death in 1915. Hundreds of Sikhs attended his funeral procession, and he became a martyr in the Punjabi community. What becomes clear in any examination of Canada's post-Confederation waves of immigration is that race and racism are central to the story. This should come as no surprise, given the inherited colonial attitudes towards Indigenous people, the legacy of slavery, and the segregationist Jim Crow tradition in Canada. In the mid-19th century, Ontario newspapers proclaimed that not only were Black people naturally savage in their native wilds of Africa, but also reverting rapidly to the savage state whenever relieved from slavery. By the 20th century, Black immigrants from the United States were being frustrated in their efforts to settle on the prairies, and Black people living in Canadian cities were subject to much of the same institutional racism found in the U.S. As Canada was establishing its industrial base then, it was also constructing a liberal racial order, a system combining overt and subtle forms of legal and social discrimination to maintain a racially ordered class society. As capitalism generated its expected inequalities, these were grafted onto the racial hierarchies that Canada was actively creating. Even the early attempts to organize the working classes were largely led by Anglo-Canadians, who often viewed other immigrants with suspicion. Employers took advantage of this racial hierarchy, generating division within the working class by hiring Italians and others as scabs when Anglo workers organized strikes. This racial hierarchy would prove to be of great significance in the ensuing period. Canadian conceptions of race would frame interventions in a global context, as the colonial imagination would be stretched to its limit in generating support for the Great War, a conflict which ultimately entailed the sacrifice of huge numbers of working-class Canadians, many of them recent immigrants. Canadian imperialism. Even while it consolidated its continental position and built an industrial capitalist economy, Canada was looking outward. Though it had gained a kind of independence in 1867, it remained tethered to the British Empire in several key respects, not the least of which was in terms of foreign policy. Of course, in granting Canada dominion over Indigenous peoples, Britain had handed over what was arguably the most important foreign portfolio. But even then, British support had been crucial to the crushing of Indigenous and Métis resistance in Canada's first 2 decades of independence. What is more, the Canadian ruling class was ambivalent about its relationship to the Empire. While some craved greater independence, many still felt deep connections to the old country and held aloft the ideals of the British Empire. The possibility of American annexation still loomed, and the Empire seemed to offer some security. The end of the 19th century was to be a high watermark for the British Empire, which stretched across the globe, dominating and exploiting people on every continent. As British enthusiasm for the Empire waxed, buoyed by imperial cheerleaders like Rudyard Kipling, much of the Canadian elite blustered and longed to play a role in the great sport. Canada's new Royal Military College in Kingston began producing cadets for the Empire, and, as it turned out, Canadians had an aptitude for imperialism, having no doubt inculcated its primary lessons in their founding foreign policy. In addition to filling posts in other settler colonies like Australia and New Zealand, Canadians were sent to fight for the British Empire in India, Central Asia, and Africa. In 1884, John A. Macdonald enthusiastically recruited 400 Canadian volunteers to help the British Empire crush a rebellion in Sudan, part of a long war to secure British control of the Nile region. One of Canada's earliest imperial soldiers, William Stairs, took part in a related British military endeavor in Egypt, during which time he documented his heroism and considered the disaster that would befall Africa if it were not conquered by the British. Have we the right to divide amongst ourselves this vast continent, to throw out the local chiefs and impose our own ideas? To that there can only be one answer: yes. What value would it have in the hands of blacks who, in their natural state, are crueler to each other than the worst Arabs or the wickedest whites? To Stairs, the miserable yellow-bellied Egyptians and the uneducated, uncivilized blacks were the antithesis of the civilization he was bringing to Africa. His first journey to Europe was followed by one to the Congo only a few years later, this time as part of an imperial force to defeat Misiri, an indigenous leader in the Katanga region, whose declaration of independence was interfering with the provinces of the Compagnie du Katanga consortium of British and Belgian capital. Stairs' battalion killed Misiri, and Stairs triumphantly reported that the European is now not only feared but respected. Yeah, exactly. And that it would now be possible to explore the country and open up its resources. Stairs' second expedition in Africa was undertaken at the behest of King Leopold II of Belgium. Widely considered one of the most rapacious colonizers and responsible for the murder of as many as 10 million people, who secured his hold over the Congo, in part thanks to this Canadian adventurer. Stairs' expeditions left a trail of death. There is no way of knowing how many people were killed, but Stairs remarked casually upon the death he doled out to the miserable, contemptible bushman, the lowest form of man, upon whom the only weapon you can devise is one which inflicts a protracted, agonizing, though certain death. In addition to the wanton murder of Africans whom he encountered and the burning of their villages, Stairs worked and starved to death many African members of his own expedition, who were routinely beaten and lashed, had chains attached to their ankles for weeks, and were even executed for minor offenses. His diaries are replete with racism and savagery, reflecting an almost surreal colonial pathology. And Ian MacKay and Jamie Swift note that he was very much a product of Canada. In the Halifax of Stair's youth, Afro-Nova Scotians were routinely ridiculed in the press and often confined to segregated institutions. In the history books, Aboriginal peoples figured as bloodthirsty savages, tamed by the beneficent Anglos who planted Halifax. Stairs arrived in Africa with an already well-developed vocabulary of race and a firm belief in social evolution. William Stairs was cut from the very mold of Canada. The attitude and the violence he brought to the Congo was precisely what he had been trained for. For the glory of the British Empire and the capital of King Leopold II, he was applying the tactics of the Canadian colonizers to Africa. In fact, Stairs explicitly pointed to the example set out by the Northwest Mounted Police, who, in Stairs' glowing review, had ruled over 60,000 Indians in the West. Stairs even borrowed a page from the colonization of the Micmac in his home province when he cut off the heads of 2 men and placed them on poles, one at each exit from the bush into the plantation. A tactic used by the early English settlers in Nova Scotia. And he made no secret of the fact that his work was undertaken for capital, boasting proudly of the openings that will be offered to the expansion of English and other trade in supplying new markets for the goods of the world. Canadian missionaries also found their way to Africa, some arriving as early as the 1860s. Applying much the same logic as they had in British North America, men like Walter Curie, who set up in Angola, worked closely with colonial authorities to teach the backwards to respect their betters. Curie worked to eradicate local practices like drumming and dancing and to establish a sense of European superiority. He also discouraged resistance to Portuguese authority, describing local villages as filthy and immoral, and in need of Christian cleanliness, intelligence, prosperity, and morality. Another prominent Canadian imperialist was Percy Girard, who so impressed Winston Churchill that he was appointed governor of the Northern Nigeria colony in 1907. Girard called himself an independent king and used slave labor to build a railway line to increase colonial commerce. When these practices sparked a rebellion, Girard sent his forces to kill at least 200 people. His rule was so effective that he was sent to govern British East Africa, Kenya, in 1909, which he promised to turn into a white man's country. His rule was so vicious that even British authorities grew weary, especially after he unilaterally abrogated a treaty the British Empire had signed with the Maasai, forcibly relocating 10,000 people to make space for more white settlers. It was a page taken straight out of Canada's settlement of the West. Girard was hailed by the Montreal Gazette as one of the 10 greatest living Canadians. Stairs and Girard were by no means unique in pledging themselves to the gospel of capital. Another famous Canadian, though born in the US, was Sir William Cornelius Van Horne, a ruthless capitalist who manipulated politicians and broke unions en route to being one of modern Canada's first greatest monopolists. Van Horne was obsessed with the virtues of war and manhood, and he admired German Kaiser Wilhelm II. Yeah. He was the president of the Canadian Pacific Railway and amassed an enormous corporate empire in Canada and the United States. His success was such that after the US conquered and claimed Cuba in 1898, Van Horne was brought in to build the railway. It was hoped that this It was hoped that his being Canadian would placate Cuban anger over the sudden invasion of Americans. He was later brought into a project to build a railroad in Guatemala to facilitate the growing banana industry. Van Horn ultimately played a crucial role in cementing the presence and profits of the United Fruit Company in Guatemala. And the dictator Estrada Cabrera, with whom Van Horn worked closely. While Cabrera viciously crushed Guatemalan opposition to his regime, the Canadian railroad man formed a close friendship and praised Cabrera for giving him every single concession he asked for. A terrible precedent was set that would shape Canadian relations in Latin America for a century. As the 19th century drew to a close, Europe was entering another active round of imperialism, conquering all who stood in the way of progress and capitalism, carving up the spoils with no small degree of rivalry. Indeed, there was a limited supply of world to carve up, and profits were harder to come by after a deep recession emerged in 1873. The European empires now jealously guarded the markets they required as outlets for overaccumulated capital. While they took it for granted that they, the Europeans, were the superior race, they nevertheless recognized that the colonies were a key component of their wealth and power, and that these colonies would not be shared equally among the Europeans. Such rivalry became apparent in the brief war between France and the newly consolidated German Empire in 1871. Germany's victory and capture of the Alsace-Lorraine region both announced Germany's arrival as a growing power and spurred French urgency in its colonial endeavors. These developments were not lost on the British, who possessed the largest empire, but well understood that the balance of power was in flux. The South African War. Conscious of growing imperial rivalry, Britain continued to expand and consolidate its global reach, even when that put it at risk of conflict with other European powers. There would be no clearer example of this than the South African War, 1899 to 1902, sometimes called the Boer War, in which the British asserted dominion over the two republics in Southern Africa, which had been previously colonized by the Dutch. In the early 19th century, these Dutch and some French settlers considered themselves largely independent Afrikaners, or Boers, having settled in the area around Cape Town. But the British Empire wanted the Cape as a naval base and later for settlement. After Britain seized the colony, many of the Boers moved inland, creating two new colonies in Transvaal and the Orange Free State, but several grievances separated the two groups of colonizers. The South African War was immensely complicated, and many of its nuances are beyond the scope of this book. But a few points are worth noting. First, despite it being characterized as a struggle between the Britons and the Boers, indigenous Africans were always a numeric majority in the area, now called South Africa, and, in fact, black soldiers often outnumbered whites in the actual war. They are typically written out of this history in the same way that indigenous peoples are written out of the stories of wars between the French and English. Between the French, English, and Americans in North America in the 18th century. Africans fought on both sides for a variety of reasons, and indeed, one of the key points of contention was the earlier Boer request for assistance from Britain in its war against the Zulu. The Boers had accepted British authority in exchange for support, but quickly thereafter rebelled and reclaimed their independence. Although they agreed on the need to repress indigenous Africans, it seemed clear that Britain and the Boers were on a collision course. The discovery of gold in the Boer Transvaal and the proximity of German colonies that might be tempted to add to their treasure chest made for immediate and compelling concerns for the British. British capitalists like Cecil Rhodes were already cashing in on the mineral wealth in nearby Kimberley. Diamonds had been discovered in the 1860s, and the English capitalists were intent on controlling the gold and diamond trade. Tensions between the British and Boer were further heightened by the fact that the Boer states had been in dialogue with the Germans as the drums of war were beating. The British recognized by the turn of the century that Germany was emerging as its chief imperial rival, a fact that would come to shape British policy in this period, and, indeed, lay at the heart of the larger catastrophe that would erupt in 1914. This rivalry over mineral wealth first spilled into a war in 1880 to 1881, in which the Boers successfully blocked a British annexation of Transvaal. When more gold was discovered on the Witwatersrand, the British determined to take over the Boer colonies for good. In 1899, they launched a bloody war to contain the ambition of the Boer settlers, protect the interests of British capitalists, and undermine the possibility of a German foothold in southern Africa. From the Canadian standpoint, the South African War would be an opportunity to illustrate both its commitment to the British Empire and also its status as an independent nation. By the end of the 19th century, the Canadian elite craved greater power and autonomy within the empire and sought to win that independence by proving Canada's capacities in service to the Crown. Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier was not initially convinced, fearing a negative reaction in Quebec. Still, after rancorous debate, the Canadian government agreed to the path set by a powerful pro-empire faction, and Canada ultimately sent 3 contingents of troops to South Africa, more than 7,000 soldiers, in tacit exchange for greater autonomy. It worked. By the end of the war, the British had removed their last remaining soldiers from Canada and granted the Canadian militia its own commander. And shortly thereafter, Canada assumed full responsibility for its own defense. Laurier further extracted Canada's right to make its own foreign trade agreements, a power it put to extensive use in the ensuing century. Anglo-Canadian pundits were quick to get behind the South African adventure, which was soon branded a romantic and noble cause to protect South Africa from the dictatorship of a murderous band of cruel Boers and to deliver the country into the welcoming embrace of civilization and the British Empire. Canadian imperialists rallied to the cause, including wealthy women in the newly formed Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire. On the other hand, the small but growing socialist movement in Canada expressed anti-war sentiment, and many in Quebec opposed the war on the grounds that it had no benefits for Canada and served only the needs of the British Empire. Opposition to the war should not, however, be celebrated uncritically. Many Canadians expressed sympathy for the Boers because they represented a similar settler identity to their own. Ironically, labor journals which opposed this war of imperialism simultaneously praised the Boer pioneers for having successfully tamed a wild country. Overall, most Canadians were willing to accept the idea that the British Empire represented progress and civilization, and that the Boers, despite their white skin and Christian faith, were closer on the evolutionary scale to the indigenous Africans they had colonized. Dissenters were labeled Canadian Boers, and the still fresh memory of the War of 1885 was mobilized to associate the Boers with the Métis, as Canada promised to carry the banner of civilization into the very heart of Africa. Indeed, on the day that the war broke out, a newspaper in Victoria declared, "Civilization advances." But the war did not go on as planned. After what it seemed would be a quick victory, the struggle shifted into a guerrilla war, and the noble British Empire became mired in a counterinsurgency that quickly got ugly. In particular, the British and Canadian forces made extensive use of concentration camps, which historian Carmen Miller described as places of death, disease, and malnutrition. The parallels with Canada's reserve system were striking, and the camps were administered directly by British Canadian author and staunch imperialist John Buchan. Having employed scorched earth policies, burning crops, looting homes, sexual violence, and executing hundreds of prisoners, to terrorize the population, soldiers of the Empire penned over 150,000 people into Buchan's concentration camps. Thousands of prisoners died in the camps, though he described them as health resorts. Thousands of prisoners died in the camps, though he described them as health resorts, and Buchan used his position to coerce Boer prisoners into selling their land to be given to British settlers. Buchan no doubt lined his own pockets in the transfers, but his primary goal was to alter the character of the South African countryside, making it more British and less Boer. Again, the parallels to Canada's policies in conquering the West are impossible to miss. Buchan would later be a narrator of Canada's noble adventure in the First World War and an open admirer of fascism in the 1930s. It's shocking. Importantly, Black South Africans, treated as an afterthought by much of the British and Canadian historiography, suffered greatly during the imperial scuffle. Nearly one-third of those imprisoned in Buchan's camps were Black, and as dismissive as Buchanan was of the character of the unimaginative Boers, he was unreserved in his assertion of Black inferiority. Through one of his fictional characters, he blustered, "Get these strange, sullen, childish, dark-skinned people hammered into a peaceable and prosperous society, and you have laid the foundation for all the virtues." Thus, when the British created the constabulary force to pacify the defeated Boers, Canadians played a key role, especially Sam Steele of the Northwest Mounted Police, who explicitly modeled the imperial force after the police who had conquered the Canadian West. It was in the constabulary where one observes the attempt to reconcile the conflicted ideology that Canada had brought into the war. Once the Boers were defeated, Canadians were anxious to mend relations with them at the expense of the Black population. Boers were recruited into the constabulary, only to discover that it entirely shared their colonial attitude towards Black South Africans. Steele himself called Black South Africans lazy and claimed that they were untruthful and incapable of gratitude. And the constabulary treated Boer farmers with preference while cracking down on Black people. Steele's experience supervising the hyper-exploitation of Chinese workers in Canada came in handy in South Africa when he was called upon to crack down on Black South Africans who escaped the compounds where they were kept when not working the mines. What is more, Canadians participated in the effort to civilize South Africa, sending teachers to support a British imperial project that bore much similarity to the residential school system in Canada. While the South African War is typically not included in the popular canon of Canadian military history, it is a significant bridge between Canada's foundational foreign policy towards Indigenous peoples and that which it would project into the rest of the world in the 20th century. Recruitment for the war drew explicitly from the veterans of colonialism, seeking those who possessed the qualities of pioneers in a new country. Some of its key personnel, like John Buchan and John McCrae, rubbed soldiers with great ideologues of the Empire, such as Rudyard Kipling and Robert Baden-Powell, and would go on to be imperial cheerleaders themselves. Indeed, Though Buchan later claimed that Canada was born at Vimy Ridge in 1917, many Canadians initially claimed that mantle for the South African War. One writer declared, "Today, Canada is a nation," while another mused that a new power had arisen in the West, and some even suggested that Canada would soon be the center of the British Empire. Behind all the bluster, Canadian capital was profiting. The British War Office had purchased some $7.5 million in war materials from Canada, and during a period of recession, companies like Simcoe Canning and Ottawa Car were pleased to get lucrative contracts for their products. When the war ended, Canadian investment flowed into South Africa with the active support of the Canadian government, which sent trade missions to establish links for private investment. By 1905, Canadian trade with South Africa had grown by at least 1,000%, as described by Carmen Miller. The Canadian businessmen saw trade with South Africa as an attractive possibility. Is clear from a glance at the Canadian Manufacturers Association monthly journal Industrial Canada, which began publication in 1900. Its lead articles in the first two issues were On Trade with South Africa and South Africa for Canadian Manufacturers. It also prodded Canadian businessmen to be more active and vigilant in the pursuit of South African trade, placed advertisements in Cape Town newspapers, and pressed the government to subsidize better transportation links. Throughout the South African War dominated much public discussion in Canada, and it is by no means forgotten by the contemporary Canadian military. Canadian Forces Leadership Institute research officer Craig Leslie Mantle noted in 2007 that the British campaign in South Africa against an enemy that blended easily with the local population, used unconventional tactics, and possessed minimal resources, is akin to those situations now being faced in Afghanistan and Iraq. In sum, the South African War illustrated and reinforced many of the dynamics that had driven Canadian colonial policy and was an early preview of Canada's foreign adventures in the 20th century. And that, chat, is the end of the reading for tonight.